It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this session on, quote, programmatic specificity we can believe in. Or perhaps, as the Prime Minister who coined those immortal words might have put it, can I say, in relation to the question of DPS compliance, let me be quite clear that when it comes to working families, the government is committed to developing some form of conceptual synthesis in order to deliver a fair shake of the sauce bottle to the mums and dads of Australia, mate. If only that were an exaggeration. But in short, must Australia be resigned to a fate of awful officialese and brain-dumbing cliché from our politicians? After all, the Americans have just traded a leader who asked, "Is our children learning?" and then demanded that we not misunderestimate him, for a leader who has rediscovered rhetorical sentence structures and insisted, "Yes, we can." But can we? And even if we do, is soaring rhetoric any better for democracy than bureaucraties? Or are they both ultimately about shaping public perceptions purely for the benefit of politicians? Are we likely only to conclude, as our aspiring Prime Minister Tony Abbott once did in Parliament, it's very clear, I think, from the totality of the opposition's question and the totality of the Prime Minister's answer, exactly what the context of the answer was? Well, to tackle the context of the answer today are former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, political journalist extraordinaire Annabel Crabb, and that one-man transatlantic institution, Christopher Hitchens. Each of our panellists will speak for 10 minutes or a shade under 10 minutes, after which we'll have some general discussion and open up the floor to your questions. Final housekeeping, of course. Everyone, please turn off your mobile phones before we begin. Anyone caught letting their mobile ring will be immediately subjected to an unending loop of the collected clichés of Peter Costello. But let's begin with a man who is anything but a cliché. Former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, whose genuine interest in clear language is perhaps no better demonstrated by the fact that he's no longer Premier. Now, I first met Nathan at the Premier's Literary Awards last year, the kind of function where Premiers swan in, present some cheques and swan out. But to the horror of his minders, Nathan not only didn't swan out, but he walked around the room and started to talk to people at every table. Even more worrisome for the apparatchiks was that the conversation was both engaging and unambiguous. Before they could whisk him off for a quick injection of jargon and cliché, he bumped into the Plain English Foundation table and said, "Plain English, do I need to talk to you?" But he did more than just talk. In no time at all, he'd announced he was issuing a memo to all New South Wales public servants mandating plain English as the standard for all communications with the public. Of course, this radical and revolutionary idea was so radical and revolutionary that within weeks he was no longer Premier. But surely that is just a coincidence. Please join me in welcoming our former Premier, Nathan Rees.
I assume that mic's working. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Neil, for that opening, and also thank you for the work. It's good to be here. Look, a couple of observations I would make at the outset, and the first is I think it's important to make distinctions between the tiers of government you're talking about when we're talking about language and communication more broadly. For state government in a jurisdiction like Australia, you're not sending people to war, unless you're talking about a war on drugs perhaps, but you're not making the sorts of decisions that an Obama or a head of state at a national level has to make. The truth is that state government and the activities therein are actually pretty mundane. You've got to make sure that the lights go on when you flip the switch, you've got to make sure that water comes out of the tap and the trains run on time and all those sorts of things that many of you are familiar with. Incidentally, for those of you who are from interstate or internationally, welcome to Sydney and welcome to Australia. But that's the reality, that the vast bulk of activity at a state government jurisdiction happens beneath the radar, and despite the demands of our friends in the fourth estate each day, you're not actually doing earth-shattering things every day. You're making sure, wherever you can, to the best of your ability, that the basic services are being delivered. If, for example, we've talked about the soaring rhetoric of the Obamas and so on, I hazard a guess that if an Australian politician sought to deliver one of those Obama-like speeches in Australia, they'd be booed off the stage. And I think there's a number of cultural and historical reasons for that, but we might touch on those later on. But Neil's point around plain language in government and plain language in communication, plain language in government departments, I think is an important one. And it's important for a number of reasons. My staff used to tear their hair out in despair when I'd be sending speeches or media releases back and saying, look, we don't use words like innovative, we don't use words like strategy, we don't use... If someone bowls up capacity building to me again, I'm going to vomit. And I'd keep sending these things back, and eventually saw Neil and prompted that memo, which I'm certain has fixed everything. But it's not just governments that do this, it's the corporates do it. Anyone in this room who's picked up an annual report or a glossy brochure from a corporate will see that the language used is just appalling. If we read these things, and you have to read them again and again to try to distill any of the content or meaning at all. And the important part of this, for mine, is that the more obscure the language is that we use as politicians, as opinion leaders, as international figures, and as media reporters, the more obscure that language is, the more people you're locking out of appropriate policy debates. Now, I think that matters. I think it matters for the health of democracy. I think it matters for, dare I say it, social inclusion. And I think it matters for the quality of public policy debate and the democracy in general. So that's what motivates me towards a plain English approach to things. Many of you in this room will have read Orwell's essays on these matters, and he himself at the time writes that we all succumb to these phrases on occasion. That's not the point. The point is to be aware when we're using language that isn't accurate, that doesn't portray things in as simple and as clear a fashion as we might be able to. So that's what motivates me with regards plain language. I guess where it becomes difficult is when you're standing up in front of a media throng each day generally, and you're having questions fired at you from a metre away, and there's cameras thrust in your face and so on. And we saw Tony Abbott this week. And I felt some sympathy with Abbott on the 7:30 report. But, true. But the reality is that in politics, and you might disagree with this, but I've got rock-solid examples to point to, the treatment of political leaders goes like that by the media. Sometimes, I used to sit next to Kevin in press conferences in the early days of his Prime Ministership in Canberra, and I'd be sitting there and there'd be very respectful media pack. And I'd be sitting there thinking, there is no way in the world I would get away with that in Sydney. And subsequent to that, Kevin now cops a hard time from the media pack down there as well. But what it means is that for our political leaders, there is no room for equivocation in your remarks. There is simply no room for error. There's certainly no room for whimsy. If you do, you run the very real risk of being smashed mercilessly for it. Now, to the eternal frustration of my staff, they would try to get me to stick to the script, and too often I departed from it. They'd have to mop up for the next couple of days. But, and I'm sorry if any of you are in the room, but that's where it gets difficult. Ultimately, there's a great deal of research being done on this sort of thing, how many thousands of messages people get bombarded with each day, that if you're trying to penetrate with a critical government message, it's very difficult. But whether it's Twitter, the internet, the print media, the television media, whatever it might be, I just don't see an option in the longer term other than seeking to be authentic, because I think people understand it when you're authentic. I think they understand that you're being genuine, even if you're getting it wrong. And I think I'm happy to be scrutinised by the public as I am by the media in the former role. But I think the Australian public understand that media treatment of political leaders also, on occasion, leaves a little bit to be desired. No, I'm not. No, I'm not having. Please understand, I'm not having a dig at Annabel and Christopher. It's a generic comment around the quality of public policy debate we have in Australia.
Have a dig by all means.
Yeah, exactly. You may be surprised to hear that I agree with you in some of what you said. I do think that there is something odd about this field in Australia. I think that, words are the stock in trade of the politician. I mean, words are all, in the end, that a politician has to bring an audience along with him or her. And the thing that amazes me in this country is that so many of them are so incredibly bad at it. I mean, we endure incompetence in this field completely unblinkingly. Now, if you're a mechanic turned up to service your car armed with a banana, you'd be kind of quite reasonably suspicious about it. But we not only tolerate but expect our politicians to speak in gibberish. We expect ministers to line up at the dispatch box in question time and dully read out this turgid prose. We expect to get halfway through a Kevin Rudd speech and find our thoughts turning to self-harm and, whether the iron's been left on. I mean, I've thought about some very unusual things during question time. And we don't kind of expect any different. And the other unusual thing about Australia, I think, often is the incredible suspicion that attaches itself to politicians who try to get any better at it. The suspicion that attaches to politicians that employ speechwriters is quite unusual. There's something kind of shameful in Australia about employing a speechwriter. There's something secretive about it. And it's often a bit of a bloke problem, I think. I never really notice it so much in female politicians, but Australian male politicians are usually about as comfortable admitting that they use a speechwriter as they might be admitting that they use hand cream or something, And I think it's probably not an accident that our last Prime Minister, I think, who was probably a recognised orator of any kind, was Keating, whose use of speechwriters was viewed, I think, in the game with sort of the same sort of suspicion as his affection for French clocks. Anyway, I mean, the speechwriters is a tough gig in politics at the moment. Kevin Rudd does have one, incidentally. I've met him. He seems like a completely well-balanced man, which is, not the Prozac-infused wreck you would kind of expect. But the thing about politicians is that they kind of, in terms of language, they fall roughly into different groupings, and they're kind of readily identifiable. My favourite by a long shot, and they do tend to be public darlings, is the ones that I call the bunglers. And these are the people for whom the English language is just this minefield. It's a sort of vast expanse of unexploded ordnance through which they tiptoe, fearing the worst. Barnaby, well, and of course the international gold standard is George Bush the Younger, who, and as we sit here, we're only about 500 metres away from the place where in 2007 at the APEC conference he made a small and gracious speech thanking Austria for its hospitality. And I'm not going to run you through Bushisms because there's billions of them and they're all in books called things like, why the French don't have a word for entrepreneur and that sort of thing. But I did want to share some offerings from the UK's undisputed champion of bungle, John Prescott. Now, he is fabulous. Obviously, departed the scene now, but he is the man who, on landing at Heathrow after having a bad flight, said at a press conference, "It's great to be back on terracotta." Or sometimes the bungler's language is so opulently bizarre that it actually starts to make some sort of sense. And this one is a particularly good one for that. Prescott, making an observation on John Major's government just before they won power, said, here we have a government disintegrating between our eyes," which is terrific. So anyway, and we've got Australian practitioners of this art, of course, Joe Bjelke-Petersen being the best-known example, although there is a very competitive young contender from the Victorian Senate, from the Senate from Victoria. Steve Fielding is rocketing up the ranks, I think, on that count. Then you have the orators who I'd call the meat and three-veg people, like John Howard, who was never particularly flashy, never particularly ornate, and had only occasional fixations with words like the word mateship, which he sort of carried around, you know, in his pocket like a treasured possession that popped up every now and again. But otherwise, you know, meat and three-veg. And then, of course, you have the Sorers, the Obamas and the Keatings and so on. But the very worst kind of political orator, I think, is the one that I call the extruder. Now, the extruder is a politician who has, in his or her head, a collection of grey, meaningless pieces of jargon that, when the time comes to fill a silence in the course of an interview or a speech or even a social conversation, will simply squirt out a selection of these words sufficient to fill the silence. And the thing about the extruder is that it's kind of like the oratorical equivalent of luncheon meat or something. It's mainly bulking agent. The other fascinating thing about it is that the phrases can often be rearranged without making any difference at all to the meaning of the sentence. And I've got an example from Kevin Rudd, which is terrific. I went to the Labor conference last year. It was the most unremittingly tedious event I've ever attended. Were you there or were you hiding?
No.
You were. Marvellous, wasn't it? And he said, he was, in the course of this speech, he was praising all of the asylum seeker activists within the ALP that he was shortly to disappoint so profoundly, and praising the battles that have been fought at Labor conferences past over this issue, although he was gently allowing it to be intuited that no such behaviour would be tolerated these days. He said, where is it? He said, "Those resolutions represented the consistency of our purpose, the conviction of our resolve," which sounded, you know, perfectly passionate until you realised you could actually rearrange all of those clauses and say, "Those convictions represented the purpose of our resolve, the resolution of our consistency." Language is only this malleable when it means absolutely nothing. And the way to spot the extruder, by the way, is there's all sorts of buzzwords. Rollouts, particularly the rollouts of things that are not round. That's a very popular one. The task forces and so on, and particularly the partnering. There's a lot of partnering in an extruder speech. There's more partnerings than a night out at Ken's of Kensington, to add a contemporary reference. Anyway, I'm just blathering on now, aren't I? I do think that one of the... okay. nothing is actually attempted by this language. It's risk-free language for a politician because it doesn't offer anything. It serves to obscure or to mark time rather than to reveal. Yeah, it doesn't commit the speaker to anything at all. And if you look at someone like Kevin Rudd, you know, what's got him into trouble in the last little bit is the clarity of his language early on climate change. You know, that's to have committed himself through language that was clear to something and then to disappoint, I suppose, is what's got him in difficulty. So it's hardly surprising that instead you hear him saying things like, and I've got a brilliant little piece from some overseas trip that he did a year or two ago, talking about, again about climate change. There has to be a greater synergy between, let's call it our policy leadership in this, which has been focused so much legitimately on targets and global architecture, almost reverse engineered back to the means by which you can quickly deliver outcomes. And on the demand side in our economy, we're looking at potential advances in terms of 20 to 25% range if you do this across the board. It all takes cost, but let me tell you, it's probably the quickest lever you can pull given the challenges we face. That's rightly. Or, there are dozens of sticking points on the Doha round right now. Let's just be blunt about it. But where it was before, which was in a pre-glacial position, we're now moving rapidly down the glacier, okay? Except, unlike moving most glaciers, we have 5 weeks to arrive at the end point. You know, it's going to take a bit more to gelignite this thing into gear. But given where things were frozen up until last time. Anyway. The one thing that I'll say about soaring rhetoric, which is always much kinder on the ears, is that it is also anti-democratic in tendency to an extent, in the sense that its pure effectiveness is to disconnect the listener from his or her natural viewpoint. It's to seduce people away from their natural opinion. So there's an element to which fine rhetoric is anti-democratic in nature as well. Now, I know which I'd prefer, whether it's being seduced by a psychopathic orator who happens to be brilliant with language, or bored into submission by someone who has no idea how to use it. But then again, I would say that because I'm a journalist.
Beautiful.
I'm glad that somebody else is also a fan of Steve Fielding's. My favourite of his is, I will go into bat for my fellow Australians who are going to fall off the cliff. I am torn between two places and a hard rock. Now, speaking of being torn between two places and a hard rock, it's my pleasure to... Well, how do you introduce a man like Christopher Hitchens? Welcome to Australia, Hitch.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Really, words like prolific get cast around with these days, but in Hitch's case, it's really a word that's hard to go past, given the range and scale of the papers that he's written for, the books that he's written, and the experiences that he's had, the commitment to his journalism. And the three examples that I think best typify that for me: writing about torture, submitted himself to waterboarding to see what it was like. Doing an article, submitted himself to Brazilian waxing.
Rougher.
It was a full Brazilian, wasn't it?
That was rougher.
Yes.
Because if you need to rip, you have to grip.
And perhaps...
Much worse than for ladies.
The worst torture of all, being smacked on the bum by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Please welcome Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you. Well, I'm rather sad to find that the weed of langue de bois has spread to Australia. I always used to think of Australia as a country where men were men, sheep were nervous, plain speech, the spade was a bloody shovel. It was a relief often to go on ABC from Washington after the terrible drool in which the nation's capital is so frequently drowned. It put me in mind when I was listening to you of Harold Pinter-esque monologue about the public lavatory attendant. I don't know if I can render it into Australia, I probably can. The attendant is doing a monologue speaking about his woes, the difficulties of the job. Because people come in there, he says, for practically anything, any reason except the real one. So you've got flashers who come in here, you've got transvestites coming in here, you've got buggers and sodomites of all kinds coming in here, people fleeing the police. When someone comes in for a good, honest shit, it's like a breath of fresh air. And you knew what he wanted to say. And I'm always trying to help people finish these sentences. And I remember very vividly staying at the old Mayflower Hotel in New York during the 1992 Democratic Convention, which was a huge fiesta of euphemism and drivel. And it was very nice to be woken up quite early in the morning and hear the almost hypnotically soothing and reassuring tones of Philip Adams. I think you know what I'm talking about. And he said, well, Christopher, can you just update us on the status of things here? Would you say, for example, that, as we seem to be understanding, that the Ross Perot campaign is now going down the gurgler? And I thought you wouldn't get that on the BBC. You wouldn't get that on ABC. They'd have found a less flowery but much less accurate way of putting it. And it enabled me to say, actually, in my view, the Ross Perot campaign originated in the gurgler and may well be returning to whence it came. As I say about the Tea Party movement now, and all similar populist movements, what it proves is all politics is yokel. Well, the other thing to say is that the stakes, as you both mentioned, both my predecessor speakers mentioned, are quite high. Polluting the world of language is a threat to democracy, a very direct one, and you can very often tell it by the sinister intentions of those who want to promote what the French used to call the langue du bois, the wooden tongue. There's a fully expressed intention of lying, if not obfuscating, flat-out lying when this happens. Claude Cockburn, a heroic figure of British radical journalism, needed to live as long as he did to make up for the time he spent in the Communist Party in the 1930s working on the Daily Worker, where he was one day idly scanning a communique they planned to reprint from Moscow, instructing the party on how to proceed, where he came across the sentence, the imperative injunction that the leading organs of the party must penetrate the backward parts of the proletariat. and when he said to the comrades, look, I'm not sure this is going to fly in Doncaster, Glasgow and other places where they sing, he said, no, but it's from Moscow, we've got to print it.